There are houses that feel like pristine museums, vast and immaculate, filled with expensive artifacts that no one ever dares to touch. The grand estate in Pacific Heights, San Francisco, the United States of America, was exactly that kind of place. It featured imported Italian marble across the expansive floors, soaring ceilings that echoed with every single footstep, and massive windows that allowed the California sunlight to pour in, yet somehow failed to bring any actual warmth or joy. It was the kind of residence where the heavy silence did not signify a peaceful sanctuary, but rather a profound and lingering absence. On the second floor, inside a bedroom decorated in soft pastel shades that someone had lovingly selected many years ago, lived a 7-year-old girl who had entirely forgotten how to laugh. Her name was Victoria, and her large, dark eyes appeared far too weary and ancient for her young, delicate face. Every single morning, she dressed herself without asking for help, brushed her brown hair into a meticulously neat ponytail, and descended the grand sweeping staircase without making a single sound, acting as though she were terrified of waking the resident ghosts. Her father, Samuel Carter, was the sort of prominent figure who regularly graced the glossy covers of prestigious business magazines, with headlines declaring him the youngest chief executive officer in the tech sector or the brilliant mind behind the modern digital empire. At 38 years of age, he had successfully built an enterprise valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. He possessed an intense, commanding presence that caused crowded boardrooms to fall completely silent the moment he walked through the doors, and he wore tailored suits that cost significantly more than most luxury vehicles. He was undeniably handsome in a very cold, calculated, and sharp manner, boasting a strong jawline, piercing gray eyes that seemed to constantly evaluate everything around him, and dark hair that was always styled to absolute perfection. Yet there was something undeniably extinguished behind those sharp eyes, a vital piece of his soul that had shattered into fragments exactly 2 years ago, and that he had never once bothered to try and repair. Ever since his wife, Allison, had passed away in a tragic, absurdly sudden accident that had not even allowed them a chance to properly say goodbye, the magnificent house had slowly transformed into an elegant, suffocating mausoleum. Samuel purposely worked grueling 16-hour days at his massive tech headquarters simply because burying himself in endless code and stressful board meetings was much easier than being at home. Victoria spent her days quietly drawing with gray pencils, having quickly learned that her father did not know how to handle tears or emotional outbursts. The only person actively keeping the massive household running smoothly was Laura, the incredibly dedicated housekeeper. She was 62 years old, possessing completely white hair that she always kept pulled back into a strict, flawless bun, and she carried the quiet, observant wisdom of someone who had witnessed many different lifetimes unfold. She had been employed by the wealthy family for exactly 15 years, had known Allison well, had wept bitterly at the tragic funeral, and now watched with a completely shattered heart as a grieving father and his young daughter lived like total strangers beneath the exact same roof. Samuel had casually mentioned to Laura on a gloomy Tuesday morning, without even bothering to look up from his glowing smartphone screen, that they desperately needed to hire a new nanny. He explicitly requested a highly professional individual with impeccable references who fully understood that this was a serious employment opportunity, not some dramatic reality television show. Laura had politely nodded her head in agreement, but deep down in her heart, she silently thought that what this broken house truly needed was not a strict professional, but an absolute miracle. The subsequent interviews had been an endless, monotonous parade of seemingly perfect candidates, all boasting incredibly impressive resumes, advanced degrees in child psychology, fluency in 3 different languages, and extensive experience caring for the privileged children of global diplomats. They all arrived dressed in highly conservative attire, speaking in hushed, measured tones and promising rigid structure and absolute discipline, making them all profoundly and utterly boring. Laura had watched them attempt to interact with Victoria, who simply sat on the study sofa with her small hands folded neatly in her lap, answering every question with polite, empty single words until Friday afternoon arrived. It was nearly 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday, and Laura was just about to pick up the telephone to cancel the very last scheduled candidate of the long, exhausting day. Samuel had made it abundantly clear that he needed someone officially hired and ready to begin working by Monday morning, but just as she reached for the receiver, the heavy front doorbell suddenly rang. The young woman who stood panting on the grand front porch was absolutely nothing like what Laura had been expecting to see all week. She looked to be about 24, 25 years old at the absolute most, with light brown hair pulled up into a messy, chaotic ponytail, long bangs falling haphazardly over her wide eyes and faded, torn blue jeans. She wore an oversized sweatshirt featuring the logo of some obscure indie rock band that Laura did not recognize, and she carried a massive, overstuffed canvas backpack casually slung over one slender shoulder. "I am so incredibly sorry, I am a total disaster," the girl gasped. Her cheeks flushed bright red as she practically tripped over the expensive welcome mat. "The city bus broke down. Then I got completely lost trying to find this massive street, and then I realized I had typed the wrong time into my phone. So is still doing the interview, or should I just go home and cry into a large pepperoni pizza?" She rambled, finally catching her breath and offering a bright, apologetic smile. Her name was Chloe, and Laura blinked in utter astonishment, as in her 15 years of working for high-profile families, absolutely no one had ever arrived at a formal job interview acting like a localized tornado. "Please come inside," Laura said gently, surprising herself as she led the chaotic young woman through the grand foyer, where Chloe looked around with her eyes wide in pure amazement. "Wow, this place looks exactly like a luxury hotel. Do actual human beings live here, or is this just a fake set for expensive interior design magazines?" Chloe whispered loudly, making Laura suppress a genuine smile as she explained that only a 7-year-old girl and her busy father lived in the massive, echoing space. Laura guided Chloe into the formal study, where Victoria was sitting in her usual stiff, perfect posture, holding a large, hardcover book that she was clearly not actually reading. The little girl looked up with that perfectly polite, emotionally vacant expression she had spent the last 2 years carefully mastering, quietly greeting the new stranger with a soft, practiced voice. Instead of sitting carefully in the designated leather guest chair like every other candidate, Chloe instantly dropped down onto the expensive Persian rug, crossing her legs right in front of the startled child. "Hello there. You know what? I absolutely hate job interviews because they are super weird and exhausting, don't you think?" Chloe declared openly, pointing at the heavy book in Victoria's hands and asking about it. Victoria blinked in pure shock, as no adult had ever spoken to her with such casual, unfiltered honesty, and she slowly revealed she was reading Alice in Wonderland. Chloe laughed a bright, ringing laugh, admitting that if she ever saw a talking rabbit wearing a pocket watch, she would run in the exact opposite direction immediately, which actually coaxed a tiny, genuine smile onto Victoria's face. They sat on the floor talking for over 30 minutes, with Chloe enthusiastically explaining that she was an art student at a local university, that she had never formally been a nanny, but loved organizing incredibly complex treasure hunts for her younger cousins. She confessed her ultimate dream was to travel to Florence, Italy, after graduation to see the magnificent Renaissance art in person, prompting Victoria to ask her first genuinely curious question in weeks about why art was so important. Seeing the undeniable spark of life returning to the little girl's eyes, Laura made an executive decision and firmly told Chloe she needed to wait 3 hours to meet Samuel at 7 o'clock. When Samuel finally walked through the grand front doors exactly at 7 o'clock, the very first thing that hit him was a sound he had not heard in years, the loud, unrestrained laughter of his own daughter. He froze in the marble foyer, eventually following the joyful noise into the study, where he was completely bewildered to find a messy, young woman sitting on the floor surrounded by badly folded paper airplanes and brightly colored crayons. Despite her being exactly 40 minutes late and openly admitting she struggled with following strict instructions, the undeniable fact that Victoria bravely spoke up and asked her to stay, convinced Samuel to offer Chloe a strict 2-week trial period. Chloe officially began her new job the following Monday, sprinting up the driveway and bursting through the front doors at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, desperately panting to ensure she was not even a single second late. The first few days were a massive adjustment for the entire household, as Chloe was wonderfully loud in a home that had grown far too accustomed to suffocating, heavy silence. She sang off-key pop songs at the top of her lungs while attempting to bake snacks in the gourmet kitchen, used ridiculously exaggerated voices when reading adventure stories, and laughed so boisterously that Laura frequently peeked around the corner just to make sure nothing was actually broken. Slowly, much like a hesitant sun finally breaking through the thick clouds after a bitterly long and freezing winter, little Victoria began to noticeably change. It started with incredibly small, subtle things, like choosing to wear bright yellow and vibrant red sweaters instead of her usual gloomy grays and dark blues, and eagerly waiting by the tall front windows to see if Chloe was walking up the street yet. One Wednesday afternoon, exactly a week after she had started, Chloe introduced a ridiculous game where they took turns building a completely nonsensical story, which resulted in a wild tale about a giraffe that turned into a tiny mouse and opened a zero-gravity pizzeria for hungry astronauts. Samuel happened to arrive home completely unannounced, just as Victoria was loudly declaring that the pizza was made out of glowing star cheese, and she was giggling so hard she could barely breathe. He stood silently in the shadowed hallway, just listening to the pure joy radiating from the living room, and when Laura quietly appeared beside him, noting that it had been a very good month, Samuel softly corrected her, calling it a wonderfully loud month. He was starting to notice other profound changes around the estate. The sterile air now frequently smelled of fresh watercolor paints or slightly burned chocolate chip cookies, which Victoria happily devoured anyway. Chloe had also brazenly started leaving her own chaotic mark on the pristine environment in completely unexpected and highly unconventional ways. She had completely reorganized a corner of the expensive, formal study to create a dedicated, messy art station for Victoria, complete with a low wooden table, scattered canvases, and jars full of brightly colored paintbrushes. Even more shocking to Samuel, she had casually used cheap magnets to stick several of Victoria's abstract, highly colorful finger paintings directly onto the stainless steel doors of the professional-grade, ridiculously expensive kitchen refrigerator. When Samuel finally pointed at the appliance and sternly asked why she was treating a luxury, imported refrigerator like a cheap corkboard, Chloe looked at him as if he were the one speaking an alien language. She fiercely defended the action, insisting that children absolutely needed to see that their creative efforts were deeply valued and worthy of being displayed in the very center of the home, not hidden away in some dark, forgotten desk drawer. Samuel found himself completely unable to formulate a logical argument against her passionate reasoning, realizing that her stubborn warmth was slowly melting the icy walls he had built around himself. What truly unnerved Samuel the most, however, was how utterly immune Chloe seemed to be to his standard intimidating corporate coldness. While his highly paid executives and other household staff constantly measured their words and practically apologized for merely existing in his presence, Chloe casually greeted him with a cheerful wave and often told him he worked entirely too much. She boldly suggested that he was missing out on the absolute best parts of his daughter's childhood by hiding at the office, words that would have gotten anyone else instantly fired, but instead kept Samuel awake at night. The very next Monday, Samuel deliberately packed up his leather briefcase and arrived home at 6 o'clock in the evening instead of his usual late hour of 9 o'clock. Chloe looked up in genuine shock from a large floor puzzle she was completing with Victoria, jokingly asking if the brilliant tech genius had somehow managed to get himself fired from his own massive company. He actually stayed in the living room, sitting quietly on the plush sofa, with a glass of expensive whiskey he barely touched, simply watching the two of them interact and listening to Chloe explain how famous artists use their deepest sadness to paint beautiful, honest masterpieces. A few weeks later, Samuel walked into the living room to find Chloe desperately trying to explain the complex rules of anatomical proportions to Victoria by using a bowl of fresh fruit. Spotting him, Chloe immediately demanded that the intimidating CEO stand perfectly still in the center of the rug so they could use his tall frame as a live, drawing model, casually declaring that his head was roughly the size of 9 oranges, or perhaps 10, if they accurately measured his massive ego. As Victoria collapsed into a fit of breathless giggles and Samuel felt a completely unfamiliar, genuine smile pull at his own lips, he suddenly realized with a jolt of pure panic that he was in terrible, irreversible trouble because he was undeniably falling in love with her. December swiftly arrived in San Francisco, bringing a sharp chill to the steep city streets and an abundance of twinkling holiday lights to the wealthy neighborhoods. Samuel had actively begun to completely alter his rigid daily schedule, permanently shifting his late evening international conference calls to the early morning hours, just so he could spend more time at home. His diligent executive assistant had certainly noticed this drastic behavioral change and had repeatedly tried to set him up on dates with highly successful wealthy women in his elite social circle, but Samuel firmly rejected every single invitation without a second thought. One chilly afternoon during the second week of the month, Samuel walked through the front doors to discover the formal living room completely transformed into a makeshift theatrical stage. Chloe and Victoria had eagerly pushed the heavy designer furniture against the walls and were currently rehearsing a highly inaccurate, incredibly enthusiastic version of the traditional Christmas nativity story, entirely populated by wandering penguins. When Chloe brazenly demanded that the imposing, wealthy tech CEO play the crucial role of the mother penguin, Samuel actually found himself loosening his expensive silk tie and agreeing to the absurd request, completely unable to resist the hopeful look shining in his daughter's eyes. Later that same night, after the chaotic play had ended and Victoria was securely tucked into her warm bed, Samuel stayed downstairs to help Chloe clean up the massive amount of silver glitter they had managed to spill everywhere. In the quiet, warmly lit space, he softly thanked her for bringing his little girl back to life, admitting his own profound feelings of inadequacy and his lingering fear of saying the wrong thing. Chloe looked at him with such profound, gentle understanding, telling him that he was actually a wonderful father, and that it was perfectly acceptable to not always have the absolute, perfect answers to everything. The atmosphere between them suddenly shifted, becoming incredibly charged and undeniably warm as they stood just inches apart on the expensive rug. Samuel could clearly see the tiny golden specks dancing in her warm brown eyes and could smell her sweet, inexpensive floral perfume, realizing in that breathless moment just how deeply he cared for this chaotic, beautiful young woman. Chloe nervously stepped back, rambling about an upcoming art history exam she needed to study for, and practically fled into the cold night, leaving Samuel completely stranded in a sea of confusing, overwhelming emotions he had sworn never to feel again. During the final week leading up to the busy holiday, Victoria secretly begged Chloe to help her create something incredibly special to give her father for Christmas morning. Remembering a brief comment about how Samuel used to play the acoustic guitar before his wife passed away, Chloe gently suggested they use warm, vibrant watercolors to paint a meaningful picture that would quietly remind him that it was finally safe to feel joy again. They spent hours hidden away in the messy art corner, experimenting with bright yellows and deep oranges, while Samuel secretly watched them from the doorway, completely captivated by the way Chloe bit her lower lip when she concentrated on a difficult brushstroke. On Christmas Eve, the enormous house was filled with the joyous, swinging sounds of vintage jazz music and the warm, comforting scent of slightly burned sugar cookies. Samuel found himself actually standing by the large, fragrant evergreen tree, laughing as he helped them hang ridiculous, handmade ornaments, until Chloe reached up to place a glittery star on the highest branch and lost her balance. He instantly caught her waist to steady her, their eyes locking in a heavy, loaded silence, while the music played softly in the background, cementing the undeniable reality that they were entirely, helplessly drawn to one another. The delicate, unspoken bubble of peace they had carefully built was abruptly shattered a few weeks later on a rainy Saturday afternoon when Grace Mitchell suddenly arrived unannounced. Grace was a 36-year-old, highly sophisticated architect from a very prominent local family whom Samuel had briefly dated several months ago, and she confidently let herself into the foyer only to find the CEO sitting on the floor inside a massive blanket fort. Seeing Samuel laughing with the young, casually dressed Nanny completely infuriated Grace, who immediately pulled him aside to coldly lecture him about the severe inappropriateness of crossing professional boundaries with a temporary employee who would eventually leave them both broken-hearted. Chloe unfortunately overheard the cruel, stinging words from the hallway and immediately withdrew into herself, her bright, infectious energy dimming as she quietly packed up her backpack to leave. Grace departed shortly after, looking smug and satisfied, leaving a heavy, suffocating tension hanging in the once joyful living room. As Chloe quietly walked toward the heavy oak front door, refusing to meet his eyes and calling herself just temporary hired help, Samuel felt a sudden, desperate surge of panic, realizing he absolutely could not let her walk out into the rain believing that was true. Samuel caught up to Chloe in the grand, dimly lit foyer, his heart hammering against his ribs, as he gently but firmly grabbed her arm to stop her from opening the heavy door. He looked directly into her tear-filled, hesitant eyes and confessed that she was absolutely not just the temporary help, and that the massive, expensive house felt entirely empty and devoid of any real life whenever she was not there. Chloe let out a shaky, breathless laugh, admitting that she had been trying incredibly hard for months to maintain a strict, professional distance, but it was absolutely impossible not to fall for him and the beautiful family they had created. Standing there amidst the quiet shadows of the sprawling estate, they openly acknowledged the terrifying, complicated reality of their mutual, deep affection. They both agreed that Victoria's fragile heart had to be protected at all absolute costs, deciding they needed to take their new romantic relationship incredibly slowly, without any massive expectations or sudden, jarring changes to their daily routines. Chloe wiped away a stray tear and offered a bright, watery smile, joking that they would take things so painstakingly slow they would practically be moving backward in time, which finally made Samuel laugh with a deep, genuine relief. As the cold winter slowly faded into a bright, blooming spring, their secret, quiet relationship blossomed in the stolen, quiet moments after Victoria had safely fallen asleep upstairs. They spent countless late evenings sitting together on the outdoor terrace, wrapped in thick blankets, sharing glasses of rich red wine, while talking for hours about their deepest fears, hidden hopes, and Chloe's lingering, lifelong dream to travel to Europe. Samuel completely stopped attending high society evening galas, finding absolutely no joy in fake corporate conversations when he could be sitting on his own living room floor, losing a competitive board game to the woman he deeply loved. In late April, Chloe introduced a brilliant new element of chaos into their lives by inviting her eccentric university roommate and best friend, Maya, over to help organize a massive, intricate indoor treasure hunt. Maya was a loud, fiercely loyal 25-year-old theater major who immediately bonded with Victoria, treating the little girl like a brilliant detective as they searched for hidden clues behind the expensive artwork. Seeing Chloe laugh uncontrollably with her best friend in the middle of the grand formal dining room made Samuel realize just how fundamentally this young woman had transformed his previously sterile, isolating existence into something deeply vibrant. Victoria, possessing the incredible, unfiltered intuition that only young children seem to have, casually looked up from her cereal bowl one bright Tuesday morning and flatly asked if they were officially a couple now. When a flustered Chloe gently confirmed the truth, Victoria simply smiled a bright, triumphant smile, declaring that she had already known for months. Because her father always looked at Chloe the exact same way, princes looked at princesses in her favorite animated movies. The total lack of drama and absolute acceptance from the little girl lifted a massive, invisible weight from both of their shoulders, allowing them to finally stop hiding their affection within the walls of the house. Encouraged by this wonderful milestone, Samuel decided it was finally time to formally introduce Chloe to his extended family during a large Sunday dinner in early May. He purposely invited his quirky, highly opinionated Aunt Abigail, a wealthy 70-year-old woman who usually intimidated absolutely everyone she met with her sharp, biting comments and zero-tolerance policy for nonsense. To Samuel's utter delight, Abigail was instantly charmed by Chloe's blunt honesty and messy bun, happily declaring over dessert that Samuel had finally managed to do something intelligent by finding a woman who did not care about his massive bank account. Later that same month, they threw an enormous, chaotic birthday party for Victoria right in the expansive backyard, inviting dozens of noisy classmates, eager parents, and close family members. The sprawling lawn was covered in brightly colored balloons, sticky spilled juice, and the glorious, deafening sound of a dozen children running wildly through the expensive landscaping. When it was finally time to cut the massive chocolate cake, Victoria squeezed her eyes shut and blew out the candles, whispering loudly enough for Chloe to hear that she wished they could formally be a family, forever. By the time June rolled around, Chloe was incredibly exhausted but profoundly proud, having successfully finished her absolute final semester of university with top academic honors. Samuel and Victoria sat right in the very front row of the crowded auditorium during the formal graduation ceremony, clapping louder and cheering harder than anyone else in the massive room when her name was called. As Chloe walked across the stage holding her diploma, she looked out at the cheering tech CEO and the beaming little girl, realizing that while she still loved art, her truest masterpiece was the beautiful messy family she had somehow managed to build. In early September, Samuel casually handed Chloe a small, thick envelope while they were sitting on the terrace, revealing 2 incredibly expensive first-class plane tickets to Florence, Italy. He explained with a soft, loving smile that he wanted to take both her and Victoria on a magnificent 3-week vacation so she could finally see the incredible Renaissance masterpieces she had spent her entire academic career intensely studying. Chloe completely broke down in happy, overwhelmed tears, absolutely astounded that this busy, important man had secretly cleared his massive corporate schedule just to make her biggest, wildest lifelong dream come true. When they finally arrived in Italy, the ancient golden city of Florence warmly welcomed them with its narrow cobblestone streets, warm autumn breezes, and the rich, intoxicating scent of fresh espresso and roasting garlic. Chloe walked through the historic plazas in an absolute daze of pure wonder, happily buying massive cones of melting gelato for Victoria and explaining the rich, complex history behind every single stone monument they passed. Samuel walked slightly behind them, his heart incredibly full as he watched the 2 most important people in his entire world laughing together beneath the beautiful, historic European sky. On their 4th day in the city, they slowly made their way through the magnificent, sprawling halls of the Uffizi Gallery, entirely surrounded by centuries of priceless, breathtaking artwork. Chloe finally stopped dead in her tracks directly in front of the Birth of Venus, tears silently streaming down her flushed cheeks as she whispered about how the delicate light and vibrant colors were absolutely perfect in person. Gently reached into his tailored jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against the small velvet box he had been nervously carrying around since they had boarded the long flight in California. Right there, standing in the middle of the crowded museum surrounded by ancient beauty, Samuel slowly dropped to one knee on the polished marble floor. He looked up at a completely shocked Chloe and told her that exactly 1 year ago, she had arrived late to a job interview and completely saved his and his daughter's lives, bringing brilliant color back to their gray world. When he formally asked her to marry him, Victoria immediately screamed a loud, joyful yes before Chloe even had a chance to open her mouth, causing a massive crowd of romantic tourists to erupt into enthusiastic, echoing applause as Chloe happily nodded. They officially returned to the United States as an engaged couple, immediately diving into the chaotic, wonderful process of planning a surprisingly intimate, beautiful winter wedding. they ultimately decided against renting out a massive, impersonal luxury hotel ballroom, choosing instead to host the special ceremony right in the spacious backyard garden of the Pacific Heights mansion that Chloe had successfully turned back into a real home. The trees were tightly wrapped in thousands of tiny, twinkling fairy lights, and Victoria proudly stood at the front of the altar as the world's most enthusiastic, brightly dressed maid of honor. When Chloe finally walked down the petal-strewn aisle, wearing a beautifully simple, flowing white gown, Samuel genuinely felt as though his chest might completely burst from the overwhelming amount of love he held inside. During their tearful, personalized vows, he promised to always laugh at her terrible jokes and to take her back to Italy every single year, while she passionately promised to keep filling his structured life with chaotic color and endless joy. As they finally kissed under the cold, starry California sky, the loud, joyful cheers of their family and friends signaled the absolute, permanent end of the dark, lonely chapter of their lives. The lively reception party continued late into the crisp night, filled with loud, swinging jazz music, endless plates of delicious food, and the beautiful, warm sound of deep laughter. Samuel held his new wife closely on the wooden dance floor, watching fondly as his Aunt Abigail stubbornly tried to teach young Victoria a highly complicated old-fashioned waltz near the dessert table. Looking around at the radiant, smiling faces of the people he loved most, Samuel realized just how incredibly unpredictable and beautifully strange the winding path of destiny could truly be. Love, in its truest and most resilient form, is rarely found in perfectly executed plans or flawless, highly predictable circumstances. Rather, it often sneaks through the cracks of our brokenness when we least expect it. When we experience profound loss, it becomes entirely too easy to build massive, impenetrable walls of cold routine, convincing ourselves that feeling absolutely nothing is vastly safer than risking another devastating heartbreak. Yet, healing requires the immense, terrifying courage to let a little bit of messy, unpredictable chaos back into our quiet lives, whether that comes in the form of a badly folded paper airplane or a beautifully burned batch of cookies. Second chances do not simply magically erase the heavy pain of the past, but they absolutely offer us the vibrant colors needed to paint a completely new, beautifully different future. By remaining open to the unexpected people who loudly stumble into our silent, structured worlds, we allow our frozen hearts to slowly thaw, teaching us that the most magnificent masterpieces are often created from the deeply imperfect, beautifully chaotic moments of everyday life.